Welcome to Art in a Post-Conflict Society, part of the Artists and Seer track, a launch track for a project here at Aspen called Anna Deavere Smith Works, which convenes artists from around the world who are doing work on social change. You know, the fact is, I noticed these banners as we walk the walk. There's one of them, Artists is Seer, that says, "Does art heal?" And in my lifetime, I've certainly had the opportunity to see that. And recently, I've been thinking about that Aretha Franklin song that was a kind of an anthem of the 60s and all of the bloodshed and catastrophe that happened in our country then. Think about it. You know, you got to think about what you're trying to do to me. You need me and I need you. Without each other, there ain't nothing we can't do. And that's really the spirit of this particular panel on art in a post-conflict society, to look at the ways in which art can step in and make a big difference. I'm really excited that the moderator of the panel is Cynthia Schneider, who I met at an Art and Cultural Diplomacy Conference in Paris several years ago. She's a distinguished professor of practice and diplomacy at Georgetown. She is a scholar on Rembrandt and Dutch art. She's also a fellow at the Brookings Institute. And now she's here with three of her friends, three of her fellows, her band of brothers, and I know that she will lead us very well down a path to a great conversation. Also, Cynthia was a former ambassador to the Netherlands while Clinton was in office. So would you please welcome Cynthia Schneider and her band of brothers.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks so much for the fantastic invitation to be here with all these interesting people and such fascinating things going on. I feel very lucky to be able to talk with you today about a very interesting and I think timely topic. It's going to be a little broader than the description in the program. We'll really be talking about arts, culture, and media and the impact they can have in societies in transition and societies emerging from conflict. And I have such a fantastic panel to talk about that with. Beginning with, and what I'm going to do is give them each a short introduction here, and I'll come back and briefly introduce the topic and then turn to them with questions. So beginning with Tom Freston to my left, who really almost, single-handedly has precipitated a media revolution that has changed all of our lives and continues to change the lives of our children and will change the lives of their children. That began in the 1980s when Tom launched, among other things, MTV, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, and it continues right up to this day when he is advising one of the most innovative programs on television, HBO's Vice, and also works with my next panelist, Saad Mohseini, in his company, MOBY Media, and MOBY Media, of which Saad is the CEO, Tom is a board member. MOBY Media, you will hear, will give you a very different sense of Afghanistan than you might have had coming into this room. It's the leading independent media company in Afghanistan, but it also reaches into Central Asia and the Middle East. And then finally, after that focus on media, we're going to turn to the performing arts and music with Phlouen Prim, who comes here from Cambodia and is the CEO of Cambodian Living Arts and was the architect of the extraordinary season of Cambodia, which just took New York by storm in April and May. And he'll talk to us about that and also about the role of arts and culture in general in Cambodia coming back from the devastating genocide. So let me just step back for a minute and frame this topic. You know, you might not necessarily think immediately of arts, culture, and media as being important in the wake of a conflict or in the midst of political turmoil. I mean, you might think of food, shelter, safe security, healthcare. But, you know, for societies to rebuild, they have to first start by rebuilding their identity. And for that, arts, culture, and media are essential. Both in terms of reaching back to the past and understanding history, and also creating a vision for the future. In addition, they foster independent, critical thinking, creativity. They can be economic engines. They foster societies of tolerance and acceptance and moderation. Now, oddly enough, it seems to me that it's often the enemies of freedom, democracy, and human rights who recognize the power of culture. Look at the Taliban destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, banning music, banning television. More recently, in Mali, the extremists attacking the mosques and banning music, which is the absolute lifeblood of Mali. And even more recently in Egypt, when a Salafist declared that ballet was un-Islamic, as a friend of mine, William Harvey, who teaches teaches music in Afghanistan, commented, saying that ballet is un-Islamic is like saying algebra is un-Christian. But these people, they know that to have complete control of people, which they seek to do, they have to destroy their cultural roots and their creative capacities. Now, we're going to look at the ways in which media, arts, and culture have shaped societies. We're going to look at it in light of, I can't find any other way to put it, what the Nigerian novelist Wole Soyinka said when he said, politics demonizes, culture humanizes. So we're going to look at the humanizing impact of culture and look at where it is working. Is it working in the private sector? Is it working in civil society? Is it working in the government? And then we will welcome your questions. So Tom, I'm going to begin with you and look forward to hearing how you will frame this whole issue. Take us back to the 1980s. I mean, can you all imagine a world, your children imagine a world without MTV, without Comedy Central, without all of these independent programs? Take us back to the 1980s and give us a sense of what you had in mind founding those companies. But I want to particularly focus on MTV because it had such a global reach. And give us a sense of the impact that it had, what you expected, what you didn't expect, and how you see it now looking back on that.
Well, looking back on it now, you can say that the media world has been, there's a lot of revolution in the air these days, but there was back then too. The media world's been in a state of revolution for 30, 40 years now, sort of always aided and abetted by technology. And the move has always been try to move media from basically what generally was a state-controlled propaganda vehicle in most countries, not the United States, but the United States even in the 70s had very limited TV choices, to a world where the consumer is empowered, has control over the media. We see almost the end state of that now, where you can watch what you want, whenever you want to watch it, from any multiplicity of media sources, be that on radio, television, print, certainly online. And you can comment on it, share on it, but basically the power has moved totally from the programmer, in many cases the state. That has been broken by the independent media in so many, many ways. The audience has been fragmented, and that has huge implications for the topic that we're talking about today, which we'll get into at some point, because obviously the people who are in these conflict societies, post-conflict societies today, a bulk of very young populations, very media savvy, and we've seen with Twitter and Facebook, satellite television playing a huge, huge role. But when we started in 1979, 1980, I mean, the vision really was, well, rather than we need more choices, and the technology was then available with cable TV and satellite that you could bypass. You could bypass a lot of things and go, directly to somebody with extra channels. And there was CNN and ESPN and MTV. A whole, became 500 channels. There's now 1 million channels out there. But we were really in the first wave of the fragmentation of the media pie, from just 3 or 4 outlets to now any number of them. And the world is better off for that, I believe.
And one of the interesting things about MTV, I think, and you still see it today with the impact of music and other forms of the creative arts, is it had a kind of political impact. And that wasn't the goal, I know. I mean, it wasn't a news show, But here you had music, two impacts really, a political impact, and then it collapsed all the geographical borders. You had young people all over the world listening to the same music, the same kind of revolutionary music, thinking the same thing.
Well, all the music wasn't revolutionary. I mean, we were one of the first people to go internationally. When Europe began to break down from the state broadcaster system into satellite and cable television in the late 80s, we were one of the first movers in there. And there was a satellite that used to go actually into Eastern Europe. The footprint went right into Eastern Europe, which was then part of the Soviet Union, and into the western part of the Soviet Union. And, you know, we were just programming music ourselves. Of course, there was other entertainment programming, but the people in those markets were very starved. And what we found out that even though it's entertainment programming, so many of the social cues that were in there to the people, the young people, were kind of enlightening and enlivening and engaging. It certainly got their curiosity. I mean, they really looked at people from the West, you know, in music, even if it was just in a music video. They saw, you know, more gender equality than they might know. They saw tolerance, and they saw more racial diversity. They saw people, sort of young people, in control more of their own lives with material possessions far more and greater than they might have. So it really, I think, piqued their curiosity and gave them a sense that there's something else out there, engaged them in a wider part of the world. We saw that replicated in Asia. In early 90s, there was a thing called Star TV that launched. It was really revolutionary at the time. It was just 5 channels. We were one of them. It went all over Asia. It was very basic at that point in time, but it was revolutionary because in all of these countries, again, the state broadcasters monopolized all media, and they had never seen or heard really of any of the kind of outside voices that BBC News, MTV, international sports.
And you know, something I remember from my daughter about MTV, which I hadn't realized, she was very excited when she had the chance a number of years ago to meet Gideon Yago, who was your newscaster. And she considered him a celebrity, and she was dying to meet him. I hadn't realized that all this time when she'd been watching MTV when she was like 10 years old and stuff, she'd also been listening to the news. And you today are working with another company that has an innovative model for combining news and entertainment, which is, of course, a hallmark also of, for example, Comedy Central's Daily Show. But tell us a little bit about your work with HBO's Vice and what they're doing.
Well, we just have a show on HBO called Vice. Vice is actually a media company. We run a suite of websites, and it's for a younger audience. And one of the things, it's also about music and fashion and many of the things young people are interested in. But one of the things we find is huge appetite for news, and news outside of the United States. And actually, we're in 35 different countries, so you know, there's a fallacy out there that young people in the United States especially aren't interested in news. I mean, it's so wrong. They are definitely interested in news, and the news we focus on, it isn't breaking news, but let's look at the 3 areas that are really going to impact young people today: the environment, the conflict, and some of the things we see going on today, and you know, various things on the political front. But we cover these things, and you know, sort of a punch to the stomach with a unique storytelling style. The hosts are not some big network anchor, but almost portray themselves as someone who's part of the audience. And they've gotten very good at their craft. It's basically what we call premium web video. And you know, we've had a show on HBO that's, I view that as sort of an advertisement for our bigger business, which are these websites. But you know, we cover a lot of stuff in Afghanistan and Cambodia and in the Congo. We go places where, you know, in Nigeria, Delta, looking at all kinds of, you know, incongruities that people find interesting. And it's been a real hit with young people. So once again, proving young people love news. It's going to affect them a lot more than it's going to affect the older generation.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Saad. I know you could talk also about Afghanistan. Maybe you'll both answer some questions. But Saad, you're dealing with a country with a huge youthful population, which has, as you have discovered, with having the largest independent media company out of 75 independent media companies in Afghanistan. You've discovered they have a huge appetite for both news and entertainment. But maybe to just frame a further discussion about what MOBY Media is doing, just tell us in a nutshell some things about Afghanistan that are different from what we tend to get in our media, which focuses almost exclusively on talking to the Taliban.
Well, I mean, if you go back to 2001, we had virtually nothing. We had 8,000 phone lines, no television, almost no radio, which was independent. So fast forward to 2013, today we have 75 television stations, 300 radio stations, 20 million mobile phone users, and a very, very young population that's very engaged. As a matter of fact, the number of people using the internet has doubled from 3 million to 6 million in 12 months. So it's a very engaged population. It's a very aspirational population. And you know what's extraordinary about Afghanistan and many of the other countries we operate in is that they're no different to other young people. They
Which
pretty
was
much
something MTV discovered earlier.
Consume everything else wishes to consume. And you know, the similarities are very striking. A format that would work in Afghanistan tends to also work in Pakistan, or also works in India, or also works in the West, or vice versa. So for us, it's an extraordinary opportunity to be able to satisfy the demands of these consumers.
So give us an idea of the range of your programming. I know you have 24-hour news, and I think that has one aspect that can't be underestimated, the importance of giving also the population a voice in the news through call-in shows and stuff like that. But you also have drama shows. You also have 2 musical shows, Afghan Star and The Voice. Maybe you give us a sense of the impact of that, and then we'll look at the sports.
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at a television station in the States, pretty much the formats which have worked well in the US, well, you know, we do adapt our shows slightly to suit the local taste. But, you know, people love music. People like to escape. They like entertainment. And, of course, they wish to be informed. But another role that the media plays in a place like Afghanistan is that, you know, the judiciary is very weak. The government, the state is very weak. So the media allows the public not just to let off steam, but it also actually highlights a lot of these, the issues that bother people, like corruption, for example. Governance is a huge issue that we cover on a daily basis. Now, of course, the state doesn't like it, the government doesn't like it, but for us, it's a very important role that we need to fulfill because that's what the audience demands.
And so you have programs. I know one area that you have really pioneered, which is fascinating to see how well it's worked there, is the kind of meritocracy program where people compete to win and people vote, the citizens vote on their favorite, either through Afghan Star or through The Voice and music. But you've also introduced in the last year football, soccer. Can you tell us about how the teams were formed and the impact that the first season last fall had?
Well, I mean, sports is always huge anywhere in the world, and in Afghanistan, like probably a lot of other countries in the region, the league itself was very corrupt, very inept. So we wanted to launch a league, and for us to re-engage the public, for them to get to know the football players, the sport itself, we launched a reality television show across the country where the selectors were able to select these players. And it culminated in a league of 8 clubs, and they played a number of games, and then they had a grand final, of course. But what was extraordinary was that how quickly the public took to the game. And Afghanistan has performed exceptionally well since the league. Half the players for the national side come from the league. Afghanistan's ranking in less than 12 months has gone from 170-something to 140, #1 in South Asia. But, you know, we've also created role models, heroes for the Afghan public. So, you know, we don't actually, you know, do these things in order to... Social change is a positive byproduct of what we do. But essentially, we also recognize that there's a demand from our viewers. We're business people. We go about the business, as one does. And the impact, some of the things we've seen in a very short space of time has been very positive.
Yeah, that's, of course, one really important thing that you bring up, all of these side effects from some form of media or the arts. It only works if, of course, the thing itself has its own integral quality. And that is true maybe of the last example I'll talk about with you. Tell us a little bit about the serial program you did with some support from the U.S. government. I know the U.S. government has, from time to time, supported your media channel. And this one was trying to deal with the issue of the lack of confidence and lack of trust in the police. And what you ended up doing is not always the most obvious thing, but I think it worked pretty well. And so can you tell us a little bit about your collaboration with our mutual friend Howard Gordon and the television show?
Well, we wanted to create a police show, not only to, police shows are very popular anywhere in the world, and 24 was a huge hit in Afghanistan, and working with Howard Gordon, who's a mutual friend of ours, the showrunner for 24, we thought, well, we should do something similar for Afghanistan. So we created this fictitious elite police unit that would deal with terrorists and all sorts of other bad guys. And the show was very popular. I mean, as a matter of fact, the actor became a huge star. And he refused to take off his uniform when he went out to the public. But again, it shows that there's this appetite for these types of programs. Just getting back to social change. See, it's very difficult to be didactic and condescending and say this is the way you need to be.
Right.
For example, one example that sort of stands out is when we had our radio program initially in 2003, we had male and female DJs discussing a whole host of issues, and the backlash was extraordinary. As a matter of fact, we even contemplated getting rid of the female DJs, but we persisted. But within a very short space of time, it became this sort of acceptable format for radio. And most of our listeners accepted the reality that a man and a woman can be in a studio, just have a normal chat. Again, it wasn't by design, but it's a byproduct of doing the sorts of things that we do. Yeah,
no, it's a really, really good point, because the underlying thing we're talking about here is really the power of narrative. It's often or example in that case, but for the 24 and the other examples, the power of narrative, power of stories that don't specifically relay a message, but that's the way, as another session told us, is the way our brains work. We work through our emotional processing, and we are moved by and remember and change our behavior according to what we learn in stories. So and you're putting them to very good use. Phloeun, I'm going to turn to you now, and we'll shift from media to the living arts. But in a way, both of you, all three of you, have changed the narrative fundamentally with the work you have done. And you, Phloeun, have been working to change the narrative about Cambodia from being the country that we just think of, the killing fields and the genocide and the victim country, to being the country that it is today, in fact, a vibrant country creating its own future. And you've done that through arts and culture. So I'd like to take you back first, before we look at some of your contemporary activities. Take us back first to when you returned to Cambodia after having fled as a child with your family after the genocide through the refugee camps to Canada, where you grew up. Then you came back to Cambodia, wanting to help your country. And you chose to do it in the arts. Can you tell us why and what you did in those first years?
I think it's coming from almost a personal journey. Because I was born during the Khmer Rouge, so in the middle of all the atrocity that was happening in my country, but I was too young to be able to know what would happen, and even barely know that 2 million people were killed during that time, and that great loss. But later on, when you grow up, you kind of read historical book and try to know more about what your country is about, and a little bit about also your own identity and culture. Even though I really grew up in Canada, speaking French, and also going back to my country was also to learn speaking my own language, Cambodian, which my parents were speaking at home, but I was not able myself to articulate that much. But when I went back 15 years ago, what I found out was that it was a country that was really trying to revive itself, but there was a lot of loss because the Khmer Rouge and many dictatorship, genocide, they killed mostly the intellectual, and it says that about 80% of the artists were targeted and killed. And when in a tradition like Cambodia, where all our traditional music or dance are through oral transmissions, it's like if there's nothing that happened within a generation or two, we were going to lose our own identity and our culture. And last night I was listening to Chris Rayner talk also about indigenous culture around the world, and then every master that is dying with his oral transmission, the world is also losing a great treasure. And so the work why I've been so much engaged is understanding why it's important to reconnect with your own culture and traditions, and then how do you engage the younger generation with that. And myself, because I was not engaged, how then I can find a way to really see if tradition is, I would say, relevant to them, and also how can they take that back and not just looking to the tradition as if it has to be the same, but how can they take that back and then moving on also the culture.
So you mentioned the importance of the masters of culture, the living masters of culture. Tell us a little bit about the beginning process when, after the genocide, of identifying and sort of bringing the masters back to their ability to use their art and passing that on.
Two really strong examples on that is, so in 1979, the war ended up and Cambodia was somehow rescued by the Vietnamese and invaded by the Vietnamese. One of the things that those survival teacher or musician did was they gathered in the capital of Phlouen Prim. Immediately, they started to look back for broken instruments. They started to look for puppets that they hide during the genocide. And the first thing that really brought people together was kind of like almost like the culture. And they did a song. The first thing that they did was a song about Phnom Penh. And it was really powerful to see how people were embracing. On the other side, on the refugee camp in Thailand, where a lot of people were displaced in the early 80s, the women who were, despite that they were lacking of food, shelters and everything, what the women did was, and some of them were teacher and dancer teacher, they started to teach dance in the refugee camp, traditional Cambodian classical dance. And so you start to see, despite of what they were enduring in the refugee camp, those young people were really engaged in learning an arts form.
And now there are a number of organizations in Cambodia, including the one that you lead, Cambodian Living Arts, that are both places of training, but also something that impresses me is the emphasis on arts management and sustainability, trying to really make sure that people can actually have careers in the arts.
Yes, because I think, a lot of, I would say, when people focus on kind of rebuilding a country, most of us are, let's say, a World Bank project or IFC or ADB. They will look to a 3 or 5 year investment and how you can change the poverty and change the country. I think it's about investing in the generations, because I think the change will only happen within what we can do to transform the generations. And so my whole idea behind that is that I think the first phase of recovery, giving back to people their identity and a really strong sense of their own pride and who they are. And so that's what arts provide. And I think the next step is then, how can we find a sustainable way so that it's not just, all of, like in our program, a lot of the children or younger adults were engaged and involved for many, many years as a musicians, as a dancer. But I think they have to be able to look, ahead of them in terms of their own capacity as a human being, and also as how can they feed their family. So where I'm very interested, because also my background is management and marketing, is to see how that can sustain. How can we transform, I think a lot of people perceive arts as something more entertaining or nice to see and nice to see. But how can, in a country that is trying to rebuild itself, that we can create sustainable model? And the sustainable model is, first of all, is looking to audience building. How can people relate to what they can see? How can people value that? And I think it's very different from the US model, where it's already, let's say, 50 years ahead of that. But at the same time, I think, we have to look at the sector as a whole, but not just thinking about artists themselves. I think artists are doing great visionary things, but I think what would need to support that is infrastructure. So arts management program, marketing, fundraising, sales, and whatever you want around that.
Well, you showed that you are very, very able to do that with the incredible season of Cambodia, which, as I said, was blanketing New York in April and May. Maybe give us a brief snapshot of that, the partnerships, and just some samples of activities. And then maybe I think one of the most moving aspects of it was the connection with the diaspora.
Well, looking to Cambodia, so 30 years after this tragedy and one of the worst genocide, is what I felt I needed to accomplish was people perceive Cambodia really through the killing field, the Khmer Rouge, the tragedy. So first of all, for the people, for Cambodian themselves, how can they be empowered and inspired by the work that they're doing? And also feel that people around the world don't look at them as, if they suffer, and because of that suffering that people want to help them, but about great arts and great creativity. And second is about how the world perceives a nation or country. And I think that will be the case of Afghanistan and also in many, many post-conflict nations, is how people have that perception. Is like, wow, Cambodia, even today I talked and I said, I'm coming from Cambodia, oh, wow, it's a Khmer Rouge, it's a genocide. But then my idea was, can we change that narrative? Can we step up as Cambodian and be able to almost, feel that with the work that we're doing, the world can recognize us differently. And so the whole idea of the season of Cambodia, which like when I was first thought about that 4 years ago, and I went to New York because we were thinking about where is the best place in the world that we can feature a project in arts so that the rest of the world and almost like the US also will understand the impact that it's creating. So we decided to focus on New York, but people were like, New York is the most competitive city in the world. How would you position a Cambodian festival there? And I thought, like, yes, I think it's probably difficult. But I always spoke about the whole idea and the whole concept of, engaging our generations and changing the narrative of a nation. So it's almost like building a movement for that. And by telling that story, people started to really be engaged. And it was 4 years of planning, of fundraising, and we end up with 34 arts institutions in New York City partnering with us, from the Metropolitan Museum of Arts to Film Society of Lincoln Center to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Guggenheim, Asia Society, and I named them all. So we had a great partnership, and I think New York really understood what it meant. And it was not just for the programming, but for the meaning and for the missions. And we brought 125 young Cambodian artists to New York City for a whole month and a half, presenting their work, but not presenting their work so from traditional to contemporary work also. So not really just focusing on the traditional, and where people would say like, oh, it's a Cambodian festival, is really more focusing on the folk things. But I think it's about the engagement in the future.
Yeah, it was truly extraordinary, and much of the audience I saw was Cambodian diaspora. Cambodia is coming from all over the country to see, and many times they'd never even seen these art forms before. So there was a wonderful reconnecting there also. Thank you. I'm going to turn back for some follow-up questions to Tom and Saad. Tom, tell us why you can do lots of things. You ran Viacom. You could do pretty much anything you wanted to in media. But you chose to work on media in Afghanistan. Why is that?
Well, I had a connection to the country. I lived there. Oops. I lived there for several years in the 70s. I ran a business there and in India. So I lived in Kabul. I was in and out of there. And I don't know, it was a fantastic place, and it always stayed with me. Sort of, very exotic, very interesting. I loved the people. There was never a sense at all that there would be a security issue. It was probably one of the safest countries, and it was as far away from New York as you could get at the time, and still is. So I enjoyed it there, but I had to leave in '78 when there was the communist coup that set off all this trouble that is still going on. You know, they're talking the other day about Syria being a 35-year war. They've already had a they have a 35-year war in Afghanistan now. But I met Saad through his wife, who had come to New York. She was his girlfriend at the time, and made a good connection with him. And this was my window back into the, you know, it was like a perfect circle for me. I'd spent 26 years basically in the entertainment business, predominantly in television, and to go see a startup in Afghanistan where there had been no television. There had been, much like in Cambodia, you know, media had been wiped off the map. There was no artists. There was no real talent pool of anyone who knew how to make television. It was sort of like the early days of MTV in a way, because we didn't know anything either. So I got very interested, and I see, you know, television is the most powerful tool that maybe has ever been invented for communicating, messaging, and as a platform for social change. You know, people think so many bad things about what's going on in Afghanistan and think the Taliban are just going to walk right back in. But I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. The population of Afghanistan has changed substantially in the last 12 or 13 years, and one of the things driving that has been their exposure for the first time to the outside world. Remember, it was a landlocked country. They were really cut off from each other, let alone the outside world. And television has brought things like more gender equality, more tolerance, a window on the, like I say, on the outside world. Has brought the arts back, and it allowed people to have a better sense that their nation is a nation, that it's making progress and going forward. So being a part of a young creative business that's making such a difference was sort of irresistible to me, and it's like a privilege to go there. So I get to go back. I get 2 free trips to Afghanistan every year.
That might not seem like winning the lottery to everyone, but we know that it is. We know that it is. We know that it is. Now, Saad, the title of the track that we're in is Artist as Seer. So I'm going to ask you to take the role of Seer now. And I know you can't tell us for sure, but again, I just want to try to counter a little bit, or at least broaden a little bit, the narrative that we get relentlessly about Afghanistan, where we have the sense the only chance of the future is if there's a negotiation with the Taliban. You're describing a country, you know, with this engaged, youthful population, people watching TV, people listening to music, people going to sports events. How do you see the future evolving in that country in 2 years? Can that genie be put back in the bottle and this repressive regime come back? It's hard to imagine.
Well, I think a lot will depend on, you know, we have a lot of challenges ahead, the political transition, the elections of 2014, and what residual forces the Americans will leave behind, only to provide the public with confidence. But one thing about the Taliban you have to remember is that we have experienced the Taliban. They're not very popular. Survey after survey indicates that their approval rating has never exceeded 10% nationally. Even in the South, where they come from, where some of their policies may be, you know, people may be more receptive to them. It's 25, 26, 27%, depending on what survey you look at. So the Taliban have no territory, and their approval rating is less than 10%. And yet there are people in Washington and other places that wish to impose some sort of a peace deal on the Afghan nation because it may suit them to fast-track their exit from the country. So the public, the people of Afghanistan, if people bother to ask them, certainly are not receptive to a return of the Taliban. And you know, there's a lot of debate now on television about that particular issue. As a matter of fact, when the Taliban mission was opened in Doha just recently, which is not surprising given that the Qataris, it's a Wahhabi regime and they support a Taliban-like regime. There was a huge backlash in Afghanistan to the point that Karzai's reaction to it was also a reflection of the public mood. So we'll see. I think that you know, much will depend on the Afghans, on the debates that we'll have in the next 18 months. The Afghan security forces are certainly a lot better than they used to be, and they're improving every month. They can fight. You know, they have their weaknesses in terms of logistics and air power and all of that. But I think we're presenting the counter-narrative that the youth of Afghanistan, 60% under the age of 20, median age of 17, which, by the way, is not unusual in our neck of the woods. They, if given the opportunity, will certainly, they have a different vision for the country going forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm reminded of what a member of the Afghan 1400 said, this is a group of young, one of several groups of civil society organizations of young Afghans who were trying to take the future of their country in hand. And a group of them spoke at the United States Institute of Peace last week in Washington. And several times, it was right around the time of the opening of this office in Qatar, and several of them said, you know, we just do not understand why the United States is negotiating with terrorists. Why are they doing this? And I'm just struck by the gap in the feelings of Afghans and the sentiment that we have in the United States. But it is, you know, given what you've done in media, it's very, very difficult to imagine that kind of drastic change going backwards. I actually, not unlike Phloeun's story, I know from an Afghan friend who went back after the Taliban fell, and it was the first time he'd been back in the country, and the first thing he did to try to show people that it was different was to find the musicians and have a concert. And he'd planned for that concert to take a couple of hours, and it actually lasted a couple of days. And that was the way that people felt that, you know, that life was different. And now I'm very happy to turn to the audience for questions. You can be thinking of questions that you have. I might just, and while you're thinking of your questions, ask Phloeun one more question. And that relates to Cambodia's relationship to the United States. We did, after all, have an enormous carpet bombing campaign with Cambodia, the larger even than World War II. And there was a very poignant moment in the season of Cambodia that was a kind of reconciliation around a work of art that was prompted by the Cambodians. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. It's difficult to think about how the perception of the U.S. stays in a country like Cambodia, who, you know, as you said, half of the country were bombed you know, during the early 70s. So one of the artists who came here on a 2-month residency program at the Bronx Museum, in fact, had this whole idea of a work that he have done, which is using a skeleton with also artifacts from U.S. Army soldier, and a parachute that he found in his village. The village were using the parachute for, I think it was a ceremony that they were doing just for the rain, and they were covering the space with the parachute, and he thought that he thought that it was looking like a parachute, so he asked what it was, and then he finally bought it and kept it for many, many years. And when he worked on this project, which was, he called it the heavy skirt, which is this whole idea of using the skeleton and kind of the spirit of this soldier who had probably landed in Cambodia with the use of the parachute, but make it as an artwork. So the work was presented in Cambodia and then in Shanghai, and then we brought the piece to New York. And in one of the partner, Columbia University, really saw this as an opportunity for reconciliations. What I've learned is that Columbia was in the 70s, I think, a place where there was in the 60s, a lot of anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. So it was really meaningful to...
It was actually right next to the huge demonstration, the place of the huge anti-war demonstrations outside Lowe Library at Columbia.
Yes. I didn't know that, but I've learned about that. And so, so instead of bringing a piece just about I would say, you know, the anger that he could have, is that he started to gather the Cambodian community, women who lived in the Bronx, who survived the Khmer Rouge and came as an immigrant living in the Bronx, and he gathered them to sew flowers on the parachute which is the whole symbolism of a heavy skirt. And so while they were doing that, they were talking about the past and how it was. It was a really strong community building project, having the Cambodian community who lived here with this artist who came from Cambodia and working on a US parachute that we found in Cambodia. And we invited the veteran, so the president of the National Veteran Association.
Yeah, the National Vietnam Veterans Association.
Yeah, came to our event with few of the veterans from, I think, from Vietnam and from 9/11. And gather at Columbia to do the ceremony of reconciliations with monk praying about this moment, and at the same time having these veterans being part of that. So it was really, really strong to see the connections in between, Cambodians who survived the war, who were living in New York, an artist here, and all the veterans. So I think it's all about the power of arts and healing also. And I know that many of these veterans now are thinking about coming back to Southeast Asia, to Cambodia. And I think, again, is how we can use the arts and the power of the arts.
That was a very moving thing. I see we have a question there, if someone can bring a microphone. And while the microphone is coming, I'll just add a slightly less wildly positive note to say it was disappointing to me that I was unable to, or at least no one in the State Department was able to find time to host some of these Cambodian artists there for a discussion. I thought it would be interesting to have such a discussion in Washington to reach policymakers, but I was told that during these dire times of sequestration, it would be bad optics to do anything involving culture. So that's why we have panels like this. Go ahead and ask your question.
My name is Akmal Dawi, and a question to Saad Mohseini. Saad, you know that donors have played a critical role in building the media environment, post-Taliban media environment in Afghanistan, financially, politically, morally. And now as they're withdrawing from Afghanistan post-2014, where do you see MOBY Group, your media infrastructure in Afghanistan? How sustainable is this business model that you have set up in Afghanistan?
Well, we don't know. I mean, much will depend on the economy and how it continues to grow. But if if we've seen the balance shift to private advertising over the last 2 or 3 years. And, but there are always risks, obviously. I mean, Afghanistan, its economy very much relies on the international community. That could happen. We as a business, we've diversified. I mean, less than half our business is from Afghanistan now. We're a regional company. But that's a risk not just for us, it's for the country itself. Our neck of the woods is, there's a lot going on, and much will depend on the political situation on the ground. Afghanistan, I think, will be okay. And of course, after the political transition, the next challenge is the economic transition and how we handle the drawdown after 2015.
We have another question here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Saeed Jawad with Foundation for Afghanistan. The question for you, Tom. Saad has alluded eloquently about what's been accomplished in Afghanistan. We did a lot of these things as a post-conflict society without really knowing what happened in East Timor or in Bosnia. We never learned from them. The Iraqi repeated many mistakes that we made, and probably the Syrian will make the same mistakes that the Iraqis are doing. So now the question is there any way for the media to make it possible for the post-conflict or transition societies to interact better with each other, to learn better from each other, and prevent some of the mistakes that we are collectively making?
You mean to learn from each other within Afghanistan?
No, Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, Bosnia.
Yeah, but as much as we didn't know anything about what went in East Timor or what went in Bosnia, and we made some of the mistakes, and we could have been much better had we known what worked in Bosnia and what didn't work in East Timor. So now, looking forward in the future with Syria, with a number of the country in Mali, for instance, I don't want Mali and Syria to make the same mistakes that Iraq and Afghanistan did. Is there any way for the media to share this experience?
Well, to my knowledge, there's no formal media organizational structure like that shares things, but it certainly would be easy to for the media companies in Afghanistan, particularly if they were to sort of form an association, to have relationships with those in East Timor and Bosnia and other people on a post-conflict basis. I think in some ways, Afghanistan's been more successful than in many of those countries. Because now you've got, in a country that had no TV, 70% of the country now gets television. And you have free media sort of guaranteed by the Constitution. You're in much better shape than many of the other places. I see the media business there getting more diverse, interesting, and I don't see, I see, what you see now, you continue to see advertisers, new products being launched within the country, and the advertising business actually getting robust. And the people who are in the television business, who are all very young, are getting much better at their craft. But there certainly can be nothing wrong with trying to get a bit more of a international orientation. And MOBY has a whole squad of folks that are around looking in markets like Libya and Turkey and Yemen and Iraq. So they already have contacts in those countries. They have done analyses of how the media organizations in those countries work and so forth. So at least for MOBY Group, they've got a bit of a head start.
But I think once people are exposed to media, there's no turning back. As Tom often says, that once the paste is out of the tube, you can't put it back in. So even in Afghanistan, if there's a backlash and a very extreme regime emerges, people are going to just switch to satellite, and people can go and launch channels out of Central Asia, out of Dubai, out of the Middle East. But what's important for us is we've built capacity. Like we sent teams around the region, and some of those team members are Afghans. Afghans who had no exposure to media. All of a sudden, they've developed enough skills to be able to go to Libya, do a business plan for Libya, or go to Tajikistan, or go to Iraq. That's what's extraordinary, is that opportunity in Afghanistan for a decade has allowed these people to really develop their skills.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other side of it, literally the work you and the other media companies are doing. How many employees do you have, Saad?
We have close to 1,000, of which 800 work in Afghanistan.
So, I mean, there's this whole fleet of young people who are also getting very important professional training. But it's interesting, Mr. Ambassador, I think your question also could open up to another area, which is potentially the role of governments. What we've been talking about here, and yes, the U.S. government, which has spent, I think, its money wisely for public diplomacy in Afghanistan and under people like David Ensor, and one of the things they have done is support projects at MOBY, and that's great. But basically, I mean, all of the work that Phloeun has done has been completely without any kind of government aid. In fact, I mean, I was somewhat critical of our government. I'll do this, Phloeun, I don't want to get you in trouble, but incredibly enough, the Cambodian ambassador to the UN did not attend a single one of the Cambodian events, nor did the Cambodian ambassador to the US. Cambodia has never had so much attention in the United States. It was in the New York Times every day. And somehow these government officials didn't understand the importance of what's going on. And perhaps the very good idea you have is something that could be fruitful for a public-private partnership. Arguably, it's the role of governments to seed that kind of communication across countries. But it's a very interesting idea. Do we have another question here? Thank you.
I'm Samia Farouki, and I'm from Washington, D.C. I want to really commend you on your efforts and the Cambodia. Unfortunately, I didn't attend any of this. But I agree, I mean, not only post-conflict, but countries that are going an ongoing conflict, like, for instance, Palestine. The Kennedy Center had a major art event where they brought many artists from all over the Arab world, and one of them was a theatrical group from Palestine, Masrah al-Qasaba, and they had a piece about that's called Live from Palestine. And the beginning scene was all these people covered with newspapers, and then just waking up and talking about how they don't want to be just pieces and data and statistics and what's happening and what bomb. Instead, they want to be written about in the human aspect and their living conditions and what they're going through. And that really was a major success, and I commend you on, because people want their identity to be covered by their culture, by their traditions, by their beautiful arts that they are capable of creating, not by all these stories about news and how they're refusing peace or they're not doing this and dialogue. They are, human beings, and they have beautiful lives, and they aspire to the same things that we aspire here in this country. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment, and I think I have to now say something that shows, again, the intersection of culture and politics in these spheres around this extremely successful Arabesque festival that was held at the Kennedy Center several years ago. In 2010, just after the festival had taken place, I was at a conference in Alexandria, Egypt, the Library of Alexandria, and it was actually an effort, if you can believe it, to follow up on President Obama's Cairo speech. The Egyptians were actually trying to do this. But there was a certain amount of anger in the audience, because there was a frustration around the feeling that the Americans hadn't done very much to follow up on this very promising speech. But one person who was an Egyptian politician raised his hand and said, well, there is one good thing that has happened since that speech, and that is the Arabesque Festival at the Kennedy Center. Now, of course, that didn't have anything to do with President Obama's speech and was planned many, many years in advance. But still, it was striking to me that for someone who was not at all in the cultural field, looking at the United States and looking at the relationship between the United States and the Arab world, the one positive sign he saw was the fact that there was this festival held at the Kennedy Center. And another thing that culture can do, another reason it's important to consider in the context of politics, also has to do with that festival. You can find out what is going on in countries where governments don't represent the people. You find out what the people are thinking through culture, through books, through movies, through music, through theater. The government might look perfectly stable, as in, for example, the government in Tunisia or the government in Egypt, which, hadn't moved in 30 years. But underneath that stability was a pressure cooker. And actually, at the Kennedy Center, as a part of this festival, was another play from Tunisia. And this was a play that Ben Ali had commissioned for the 50th anniversary of Tunisia. But when he saw the play, it never saw the light in Tunisia. He didn't like it. Instead, it was shown at the Kennedy Center, and the plot of this play was a young Tunisian who is unable to make his way in his country, unable to find employment, unable to support himself, to the point that he is eventually driven to suicide. And that was in Washington, D.C., a year and a half before the Tunisian Revolution. I know one more question.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a great panel. I'm Nick Burns from Harvard University. I wanted to ask about the role of the U.S. government, and particularly, we participated in military operations, as you well know, the last 12 years in Afghanistan, in Cambodia. What can we do as a government? What should we be doing to help nurture the stability in your societies that comes through promoting culture? Is there a role, Saad? You praised David Ensor, who is the U.S. government's public affairs representative. What can we learn from what he did there?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think it's very important that media organizations are protected from government intimidation and censorship. It's very important. You do have a lot of clout in most of these countries. You have a lot of leverage. And I think the red line should be governments clamping down on media organizations and journalists. I think that's a very important issue, because a lot of times, when we are we've had people beaten up and arrested and shot at. Usually, the U.S. Embassy goes very quiet because they have so many other issues, and the last thing they want to do is confront, say, the Afghan government. The other important thing is, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on your own efforts. There's a BBG, and you have various channels, Al Hurra and Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe, amongst others. I believe that private media organizations can do a much better job. You will be a lot more effective working with local media companies in terms of developing content that's going to be acceptable to these small, these local audiences. I mean, for example, Al-Hura, with the exception of Iraq for a period, has been a complete failure. And yet hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on these organizations. So I think you need a very proactive approach. You need someone who understands the media, who's not a bureaucrat, who works on behalf of the US government and works with local media organizations. I mean, that's my feeling. I mean, you may have a different opinion.
I think in the case of Cambodia, again, it's US are mostly engaged with all the conflict in the world, and in the 70s and the late 60s and 70s, and after the Vietnam War, the US just pulled out of the region, completely letting the people there. In the case of Cambodia, where it was a neutral country, the US government had helped to put in power a general to take over the country, and then later on the Khmer Rouge came. I think one of the lessons learned is when you decide to be engaged in a region, is like that you don't pull out immediately, not looking to what's happening in that region and with the people. I think that's the first thing to see. Second is yesterday I was also listening to Madeleine Albright and the discussions about soft power. There's so much you can do in terms of the educations, the arts, the culture, and helping accompanying these nations to kind of slowly rebuilding themselves, and I think it's about the human resource, and it's about educations, and how do you help providing strong human resource and education to these populations, so that we don't come to conflict later on. So I think there's this in the case of what we're doing now, yes, we don't have much support from the U.S. government, and there's a great community. What I find extraordinary is in the US is you have these great philanthropists, donors who really believe in those larger missions, and although they're not part of that culture, but they believe on the change that can affect. So I think that is really one of the great model of I would say the people in the US. The government is another issue. And just responding to Cynthia, questions about the government involvement, I think in the arts, do we really want the government to fund or to give money to the artists? I think it's about freedom again, and how free can artists be in their artwork and the work that they're doing. And I think for me, it's the only thing that I'm asking the government is at least not to interject or stop these projects and let that go. Instead, I think the government has our policymaker looking to the infrastructure, and I think it's very important to separate the freedom of expression of these artists and what the government intention is.
Yeah, absolutely good point. I'm just going to conclude with two quick points to follow up on that. You do have, though, Phloeun, the very good idea, which anyone who has a pull with the Cambodian government can press, that they tax just slightly tickets to Angkor Wat Temple, maybe $50 50 cents a ticket or something, to put towards a fund to support the living arts, which hopefully wouldn't come with control. And then just on the need for education, I can never get out of my mind what one of your young fellows who came with the season of Cambodia, an archivist, said when he visited the monuments in Washington, Lincoln Monument, Washington Monument, and the Martin Luther King Monument. He had never heard of any of them. He was a college-educated, fluent in English archivist. And he said, all we know about the United States, all we are taught, is the Vietnam and Cambodian wars. So there's room for a few donated professorships in American history, I think. So thank you so much for my wonderful panel. Thank you. You were a great audience.